A week after the Colonial Pipeline came back online after a cyber attack that prompted a sudden fuel shortage, panic buying, and a spike in gas prices along much of the East Coast, the company's CEO is admitting he paid a multi-million-dollar ransom to the hackers. Joseph Blunt told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "I know it's a highly controversial decision. I didn't make it lightly. I will admit that I wasn't comfortable seeing money go out the door to people like this." The total, 75 Bitcoin, or roughly $4.5 million, which hackers demanded after locking Colonial Pipeline out of their communication systems in what's aptly known as a ransomware attack, the likes of which we've seen plague a TV station in Australia, the National Health Service in the UK, global telecom giants, and private citizens concerned their private personal data would be released. The Colonial Pipeline CEO told the Journal that paying up was, quote, "the right thing to do for the country." Many others aren't so sure. In fact, the U.S. government has long advised companies not to give in and pay the ransom, arguing it will only incentivize hackers to attack again. But when it comes to preventing attacks and keeping American companies and citizens safe, my next guest makes the case the federal government doesn't have much of a leg to stand on. Nicole Perlroth is the author of This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyberweapons Arms Race. She's also a cybersecurity reporter for the New York Times, and she joins me now. Nicole, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have viewers who will know the world that you describe in your book intimately, and other viewers for whom it's totally unfamiliar. So for the latter group, can you offer a layperson-friendly explanation of what a cyber weapon is?
So a cyber weapon is basically just code that exploits a vulnerability in other code to do things like turn off your uranium enrichment centrifuges, or take out your power grid, or contaminate your water supply. And at the most basic level, we are finding that there is actually an entire market dedicated to the development of cyber weapons, and that governments are one of the biggest spenders and sponsors of this market.
I want to get specifically to the U.S. role in creating this world in just a second, but you start off the book in Ukraine to convey the damage that was caused by a series of Russian cyber attacks a few years ago, escalating cyber attacks. For people who might not remember that story, what sort of toll did those attacks take?
So in 2017, we don't know who they were. We just know that a group showed up on Twitter one day. They called themselves the Shadow Brokers, and they claimed to have stolen the NSA's best kept cyber weapons. And lo and behold, over the next several months, they started dribbling out some of the NSA's best kept hacking tools. And one of those tools was some code called Eternal Blue that exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft software. And right away, we saw North Korea pick up that tool and bolt it onto the ransomware and send it in an attack that held up UK health systems, held up UK hospitals. People were getting turned away from urgent care. It hit universities and businesses all over the world. Fortunately, the North Koreans had been pretty sloppy with their code, so a hacker in the UK was actually able to find a kill switch to turn it off. But about a month later, Russia picked up the NSA's tools and they fired it in an attack on Ukraine that was supposed to look like ransomware. But in fact, there was no way for victims to pay any ransom that would get back their data. And they hit government systems, they hit postal service systems, they hit railways. People couldn't get money out of ATMs. They couldn't get, they couldn't pay for gas. And even the radiation monitors at the old Chernobyl nuclear site were frozen. So they had to go out, send people out by hand to monitor radiation levels manually. But what happened was that code didn't just hit Ukraine, it hit any business that even had a single employee working remotely from Ukraine. So it zoomed around the world. It hit Cadbury chocolate factories in Tasmania. It hit Maersk, the world's largest shipping company, and paralyzed shipments. It hit Merck. Merck actually had to tap into the CDC's emergency supplies of the Gardasil vaccine that year because their vaccine productions had been wiped out. FedEx had something like $400 million in damage. And all told, there was more than $10 billion from that one single ransomware attack in 2017. And companies still haven't been paid out for them, because when they tried to file a claim with their insurance companies said, we do have this little war exemption in your clause that says if you are collateral damage in an act of war, we don't have to pay this out. And we believe you were collateral damage in a war, an ongoing war by Russia on Ukraine.
You mentioned that this was Russia using a tool developed by the National Security Administration. At the time that our defense establishment was developing offensive tools to wreak havoc with computer systems and computer-linked systems in other places, did anyone say, maybe this isn't a great idea and this could come back to haunt us? Or did that awareness not develop until recently?
I think starting in the second Bush term, someone must have raised a red flag, because they did set up a very secret process at the time. It has a terrible name. It's called the vulnerability equities process. But basically what it entails is someone at the White House sitting around a big mahogany table with representatives from various other US agencies and the NSA, but also probably DHS and some other civilian agencies. And when they would find a vulnerability in code that they could use for espionage, but could potentially come back to haunt us, they started having these debates about, should we really be holding on to this? And if so, for how long? And what are the various reasons for this? And so for my book, I went back and interviewed several of the people who led that process for the White House. And basically they said, we're not going to lie to you. This is more of an art than a science. And sometimes there's blood left on the table. And sometimes we really regret some of the decisions that we made in those discussions.
That's a terrifying answer. I mean, the whole book is terrifying. The entire topic is terrifying. If we had more time, I'd ask you about the black market that developed in finding these vulnerabilities, because it's a big part of your book and it's really, really interesting. But I want to cut to the chase, I guess. The title of your book is Apocalyptic and Terrifying by Design. Can you flesh out for me what a world-ending cyber attack might look like and what it might do?
Well, I think the book is really my learning journey. In the beginning of the book, I'm being warned of this calamitous attack that would look something like a hack of air traffic control that would send two planes colliding into one another or colliding into a building like 9/11. Attack on the water supply that would really be the more silent killer, where they could up the level of chemical in the water and badly poison the water supply for a large metropolis. Those are sort of the big world-ending attacks that people have talked about. But by the end of this 7-year journey, it took me 7 years to do this book, I sort of come out in a more nuanced place, which is, that attack might happen, and it is imminent. We actually just had an attempt to poison the water supply in Oldsmar, Florida, just ahead of the Super Bowl a few months ago. Unfortunately, someone happened to be sitting at their screen and caught their cursor moving around without their hand moving. So those attacks do feel more imminent than they ever have. But I also think they're this distraction from where we already are, which is a pipeline was just shut down because of a ransomware attack. Our intellectual property has been pillaged by China for the last decade. We've caught Russia hacking into our grid. We caught them breaking into a nuclear plant's IT system in Kansas. And now we're unwinding the SolarWinds attack, this Russian intelligence hack of our federal agencies, the Department of Energy, even the nuclear labs, on and on and on. And so why are we waiting, really, is the question of the book. Why are we waiting to shore up our cyber defenses? Are we just going to wait for those planes to crash in a hack of air traffic control? Or can we really just take a look around at where we already are and start seriously recalibrating a national security for cybersecurity?
You've got about 1.5 minutes left. What do you think the odds are that people in the government will do exactly what you just suggested?
I actually am more hopeful right now than I ever have been. To see an American president get up there last week and go to the podium and talk about a ransomware attack is unprecedented. That is progress. And to call out Russia for being a safe haven for a lot of this activity, that's progress. We didn't see that in the previous administration. So that's good. The other thing is we now have a national cybersecurity director position. Chris Inglis is the guy who's been nominated for that position. He really is the right guy for the job. We just had this executive order that looks good on paper, but will clearly come down to execution. And I do think we're putting some of the best people in place to do this, but there's no silver bullet. These are really hard problems. Our cyber vulnerability is extremely vast and only getting more so as we plug in millions more devices to the internet and so much more critical infrastructure. But I am very hopeful that the right people are in position to do something about this.
Really quickly, is there bipartisan support for taking this seriously at this point?
I think yes.
Good.
I think there's bipartisan support. The big thing is 85% of America's critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. And traditionally, the GOP has said we don't want any regulation, even if it's just mandating that they up their cybersecurity. But I think that might change after the Colonial Pipeline episode.
I feel marginally less terrified after talking to you than I did after reading the book, Nicole Perlroth. Thank you for making time to discuss this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.